My wife had planned that moment long before we sat down. She called the bank that morning and had the card suspended, not because she feared I might overspend, but because she wanted everyone at that table to watch me fail in public. She wanted her mother, her sister, and the man she had been spending her evenings with to see exactly what she believed I was: a man with nothing, no standing, and no way to answer back. What she did not know was that the bank she called that morning reported to me. So why did I say nothing about it? If you want to find out what happens when the truth finally comes out and why I chose to stay silent as long as I did, subscribe to the channel and keep listening. This story is just getting started. There is a version of my life that other people believe in completely, and for 11 years, I let them. In that version, I am Garrett Monroe, the husband who stays home, the man with no office, no title, no public profile worth searching. I drive a 2009 Subaru with a dent above the rear wheel well that I keep meaning to fix. I cook dinner when Meredith works late. I fix the leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom myself rather than calling a plumber. At dinner parties, when someone asks what I do, I say financial consulting, and then ask them about their work instead, and that is usually enough to redirect the conversation entirely. People see what they expect to see. I learned that a long time ago, and I never tried to correct them. What none of them knew, not her family, not her colleagues, not the people who smiled at me across restaurant tables while quietly forming opinions, was that I founded Halcyon Financial Trust 17 years ago, built from a small credit fund my grandfather left behind. That fund became a private equity structure, which became a controlling interest in Palisade National Bank, which eventually required layers of holding companies and trust entities just to keep my name out of the documents that circulated publicly. That was not an accident. It was a design choice I made deliberately, rooted in something my grandfather Calvin told me when I was 23 years old and still thought wealth was something you displayed. Calvin Monroe ran a small lending office in Colorado Springs for 40 years. He wore the same 3 sport coats in rotation and drove a truck that needed a firm kick to the passenger door before it would close properly. He was also quietly one of the most financially influential men in the state, though almost no one knew it. He told me once that money, when announced loudly, only attracts people who want the money. But when it stays invisible, you get to see who actually shows up for you. The quality of the people around a man in ordinary clothes is the truest test of his character that exists. I was young enough to think that was just something old men said. It took me 11 years of marriage to understand he was right about everything. When I met Meredith, she was an analyst at Ironwood Development Partners, working 60-hour weeks on proposals that her supervisors would present under their own names. She was sharp in a way that had no performance in it. She did not talk about how intelligent she was. She simply solved problems faster than the people around her and moved on. I fell in love with that quality before anything else. We married in the fall 2 years after we met in a small ceremony outside Denver. Her mother, Darlene, gave a toast that was mostly about Meredith's accomplishments. Her sister, Paige, posted 17 photos before the reception ended. I did not mind any of it. I was happy in a way that felt uncomplicated, which I now recognize as the most dangerous kind of happiness there is. In those early years, I helped where I could without explanation. When Meredith was preparing for a major pitch and her financial model had a structural flaw she could not locate, I sat with her at the kitchen table past midnight and walked her through it, not by solving it for her, but by asking the right questions until she found it herself. I introduced her carefully and indirectly to people who could open doors at Ironwood. I made sure Palisade looked closely at 2 of Ironwood's early development proposals, though I stayed entirely outside the review process once I flagged them. She earned every promotion that followed. I want to be clear about that. The work was hers. I only made sure the right people had the chance to see it. What I did not account for was what success would do to the way she saw me. It did not happen overnight. It was gradual, too slow to observe in any single moment, visible only when you step back and look at the shape of something that has been changing for years. As Meredith moved into senior roles, she began spending more time with people who measured a person's worth in titles and square footage and the watch on their wrist. She started introducing me at events with the slight verbal hesitation that meant she was deciding whether to say more than choosing not to. She stopped asking my opinion on her work. Small things, easy to excuse individually. I kept telling myself she was under pressure, that her environment was changing her temporarily, that the woman I married was still there and simply tired. Then Brent Hargrove arrived at Ironwood as director of strategy, and the temperature in my marriage dropped 10 degrees without a single direct conversation about it. Brent was someone who entered a room already performing for it. He wore his suits to be noticed, laughed at exactly the right volume, and had a talent for identifying what a person wanted to hear and then saying it. Around Meredith, he was consistently and pointedly present. He told her twice in my hearing that a woman of her position deserved a partner who could match her publicly, someone with a visible career, visible standing. He never said my name when he said it. He did not need to. Meredith stopped telling me when she was working late, and I stopped asking, and somewhere in that silence, a decision was being made that I was not part of. The dinner at Orchard and Stone was my idea. Meredith had just been named executive director for the Silver Basin Project, the largest deal in Ironwood's history, and I wanted to celebrate with her, privately, just the two of us, a good meal and a chance to close the distance that had been growing between us for months. I reserved a private room and told her about it 2 days before. She said it was a good idea and that she might invite a few people. By the night of the dinner, the guest list had grown to include Darlene Page Brent and 3 of Meredith's senior colleagues. I understood then that the evening had become something different, not a celebration between 2 people, but a stage she had built for herself. I arrived in the same suit I had worn to 3 other dinners that year. Page noticed within 60 seconds, making a comment that carried the easy cruelty of someone who has never been in a room where she needed to be careful. Darlene asked me in front of everyone whether I had any prospects for what she called a real position because she worried about how much Meredith was carrying on her own. Brent was already seated beside Meredith when I arrived, using a nickname for her I had never heard before, referencing a business trip to Seattle the way you reference a shared private language. Meredith accepted it all without correction, laughing in the loose, generous way she no longer used at home. What I did not know until the bill arrived was that she had made a phone call to Palisade National Bank earlier that morning. The card I kept in my wallet was a secondary card tied to a household spending account in Meredith's name. I used it for ordinary purchases, groceries, the occasional dinner out, the texture of a shared life. I used it because it was simple and because my actual assets lived in structures that had nothing to do with that account. As the primary account holder, Meredith called the bank, gave her authorization, and had the card suspended before we sat down. The system processed it automatically. She said nothing to anyone at the table, which told me everything about what she was planning to let the moment do on her behalf. When the bill came, she pushed it toward me with both hands too deliberate to be casual. I handed the card to the server. A minute later, he returned. The transaction had not gone through, and he delivered the information the way people at good restaurants are trained to handle discomfort, quietly, professionally, without drama. Meredith filled the silence before it could settle. She announced clearly enough for the whole table that she had suspended the card because she was done watching her income disappear into expenses Garrett contributed nothing toward. Darlene laughed with the satisfaction of someone whose long-held suspicions had just been confirmed. Paige lifted her phone and began filming. Brent raised his glass and offered, in a tone designed to sound generous, to cover the bill. Meredith looked at me and said that if I wanted the card reinstated, I could start by apologizing to her in front of everyone. I did not look at Brent. I did not look at Darlene or Paige or any of her colleagues. I looked at my wife and thought about the 11 years behind us, and I felt something settle in me that was not calm and not grief, but existed somewhere between the two. The restaurant manager appeared at my elbow. His name was Richard, and he had overseen 4 private executive meetings for Halcyon in the back rooms of this building over the past 3 years. He recognized me the moment I walked in, had been watching the table, and when he leaned down beside me, he spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. He offered to move the entire bill to the executive account, and the way he said it made clear he understood exactly what was happening and wanted no part of it on his establishment's behalf. I thanked him and told him not to. I paid for the dinner in cash enough in my wallet as nearly always and said nothing further about the card. The table recalibrated. Brent made a remark about crisis management. Meredith accepted congratulations on her promotion from her colleagues, and the evening continued as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Later that night, after we returned to Foxmere House, she told me I should consider the evening a wake-up call. She was not wrong, it was exactly that. She was only wrong about what I had been woken up to. The video page posted went live before midnight 37 seconds of the moment cut to make its meaning unmistakable. The caption implied that Meredith had been subsidizing a husband who could not cover a dinner. By the following morning, it had been shared inside several Ironwood group chats and had drawn comments from people who had never met me, all of them with confident opinions about my character. Meredith saw the post and did not ask Paige to take it down. When I mentioned it, she said without particular cruelty that maybe it would motivate me to be more useful. She said it the way you say something you have been thinking for a long time and have finally decided to stop filtering. I did not call Eleanor. I did not open my accounts on my phone and hold the numbers out like a counter-argument. What I understood, standing in the kitchen of a house I had purchased 17 years into building something that had never required me to perform its existence, was that the woman I had built a life with had made a decision about who I was, and she had made it long before last night. From that point forward, my silence was not patience, it was attention. I was paying close attention to everything. The week after the dinner, Meredith changed the passwords. Not just the one on the household spending account, she changed the login for the joint utility portal, the grocery delivery service, the parking permit linked to the car registered in her name. She did it methodically, 1 platform per day, in an order that suggested she had thought about the sequence in advance. When I noticed the first change, I said nothing. When I noticed the third, I understood that this was not a security precaution. It was a perimeter being drawn slowly and deliberately around every ordinary convenience 2 people share after a decade of living together. She told me one evening while scrolling through her phone at the kitchen island that she wanted me to start submitting receipts for household purchases. She used the word submitting the way a manager uses it with an employee already on a performance plan without looking up, as though the request were administrative rather than what it actually was, a declaration that the financial ground beneath me was now under her control and I should understand my position accordingly. I did not argue. I took the notepad she left on the counter, wrote down the $43 I had spent at the hardware store that morning, and set it next to her coffee. Darlene arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the energy of someone who had been waiting for an occasion. She walked through the rooms of Foxmere House with her reading glasses on, lifting objects, examining furniture, asking Meredith which pieces had been purchased with Meredith's income. The question was framed as housekeeping. Its actual function was inventory, the kind taken when someone is preparing to make a claim. Meredith followed her through the rooms, naming sources, the sectional, the dining table, the artwork above the fireplace. Foxmere House was not in Meredith's name. It was not in my name directly either. It had been purchased through a holding company belonging to one of the subsidiary trusts inside Halcyon structure. Years earlier, when we bought the house, I told Meredith simply that holding property through a corporate entity was cleaner for tax purposes. She had not been particularly interested in the details. She signed what she was asked to sign, which gave her residential rights but no ownership stake, and she had not revisited the question since. Over time, I think she had simplified the memory the house was theirs, held in a company name, and in a divorce that company's assets would be divided like everything else. She believed this completely, and I had never given her a reason to examine it more carefully. Paige arrived that same afternoon, ostensibly for coffee, but mostly to film. She walked through the kitchen, narrating quietly for her phone, cataloging the built-in shelves, the woodworking tools in the garage, the reading chair near the window where I spent most of my evenings. She told her audience, in the cheerful tone she used for everything, that her brother-in-law would soon need somewhere considerably smaller. Brent had begun appearing at the house without much pretext. He would arrive in the early evening while I was still there, and he and Meredith would open their laptops at the kitchen island in a way that was close enough to ordinary professional collaboration to be technically deniable. He made observations about the living room furniture, suggested the hallway shelving was inefficient, offered opinions about what the space could become with a few changes. Small assertions delivered with the ease of someone who had already decided where he belonged. I would finish cooking, leave a plate in the kitchen, and take mine to the study. I was not avoiding a confrontation, I was refusing to stage one on his schedule. Then I came home early on a Tuesday and found Meredith's laptop open on the dining room table. She had left for an afternoon meeting in a hurry and had not closed the screen. I was not looking for anything. I set my keys down, saw the subject line, and read it in the time it takes to register something you were not expecting and cannot immediately look away from. The email chain was between Meredith and Brent, sent through their Ironwood accounts over the previous 3 weeks. They were not discussing something they were considering. They were executing a plan. Brent had outlined across several messages a strategy for characterizing me during the divorce proceedings: unemployed, financially dependent, contributing nothing of measurable value to the household or to Meredith's career. He flagged the video from Orchard and Stone as useful supporting material visual evidence of a husband who could not cover a dinner. The goal, stated plainly in one message, was to establish that I had entered the marriage without assets and would leave it the same way, minimizing any claim I might bring. Further down the chain, Brent noted that once the divorce was finalized, he intended to put Meredith's name forward for a seat on Ironwood's internal advisory board, a title, a larger salary, and proximity to senior decisions. It was phrased as recognition of her abilities. It appeared 2 paragraphs below a discussion of how to make her husband look worthless in front of a judge. I closed the laptop. I stood in the dining room of that house and thought about the night I had sat at this same table with Meredith until past midnight, working through a financial model that had a flaw she couldn't find alone, asking her questions until she located it herself. I thought about the calls I had made quietly on her behalf, the doors I had helped open without explanation. Then I set all of it aside because Eleanor was calling. Eleanor Maddox did not call without a reason. When I answered, she told me that Palisade's risk management team had flagged irregularities in the Silver Basin project during a routine portfolio review. Ironwood had understated a significant tranche of existing debt in their disclosure documents. The revenue projections submitted to the bank were materially higher than what the underlying contracts could support. The person whose signature appeared on the final submission, the one sent to Palisade as part of the drawdown application, was Meredith. Brent had built the financial presentation. Meredith had signed it. Eleanor asked how I wanted to proceed. I told her to initiate an independent audit, external reviewers, no internal bias in any direction, no adjustments made to favor any outcome I might personally prefer. I then formally recused myself from all board decisions related to Ironwood until the process was complete. Whatever the audit found, it would be handled according to the bank's standard procedures. Eleanor recorded the recusal in the meeting minutes without comment. After I hung up, I sat with what I now understood. Meredith had been building a legal portrait of me as worthless, while simultaneously signing documents that misrepresented financial reality to a bank I owned. The two things shared a common structure, a willingness to use whatever tool was available to secure a preferred outcome without examining too carefully what that tool was or who it might damage. I could not separate my feelings about one from my obligations regarding the other. The bank was not just mine. It belonged to its shareholders, its employees, its depositors. I could not let personal pain become the reason I looked the other way. The following week, Meredith told me that Brent would be moving into Foxmere House once the divorce was finalized. She said it at breakfast on a Wednesday with the tone of someone announcing a renovation schedule. She needed me out before the end of the following month. She would have her attorney send a list of items she considered jointly owned. Darlene called that evening to say I should feel grateful Meredith was not seeking reimbursement for what she described as the years she had spent carrying the household. I did not respond to Darlene. There was nothing I could say to reach the part of her capable of hearing it. The temptation to act was real, and I want to be honest about that. One conversation with Eleanor, one board resolution, and the credit facility underpinning Silver Basin would be suspended pending audit completion. Ironwood's largest project would stop. Meredith's executive role would become, overnight, a position managing a crisis. Brent's strategy portfolio would collapse under the weight of the irregularities he had designed. I could have done all of it before lunch on any given day, and the infrastructure was already in place. But Calvin's voice was more persistent than my anger. A man who turns an institution into a personal weapon has not won anything, he has only revealed what he was willing to become. The bank was not mine to use that way. I was not willing to pay that price even for this. So I let the audit run on its own schedule. I let the recusal stand. I let Meredith believe for several more weeks that she was operating without consequence. The divorce papers arrived on a Friday evening. She placed them on the dining room table with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. The document was thorough. Foxmere House claimed as a joint marital asset the car, the household contents, a settlement figure calculated on the assumption that I had contributed nothing of independent value to the marriage. In exchange for releasing all other claims, she offered a number that reflected exactly who she believed I was. I read through it. Then I asked whether the 11 years we had spent together had meant anything to her at all. She said she had loved the man she thought I had the potential to become, not the man I had chosen to be. Before I could respond, I heard the front door open. Brent walked in with the key Meredith had given him and set his bag near the staircase with the ease of someone who had already made a decision about where he belonged. I did not say anything to either of them. I walked to the small study off the hallway, closed the door, and took Calvin's old ledger from the bottom shelf. Sitting with that ledger in my hands, I thought honestly for the first time about whether I had been wrong. Not about building Halcyon, not about the philosophy of quiet wealth. Wrong about the silence itself, whether I had confused restraint with wisdom until it had become something closer to disappearing. Whether I had given the people around me so little information that they had simply written their own version of me, and I had allowed that version to go unchallenged until it was being used in a legal filing. Then my phone lit up on the desk. Eleanor again. I answered on the second ring. The audit was complete, she said, and what they had found went further than the disclosure irregularities. Meredith and Brent had submitted fabricated lease agreements to satisfy the conditions for the next disbursement. That crossed a different legal threshold entirely. Outside counsel was already involved. She needed me in the building. I set the ledger aside and told her I would be there in the morning. I asked her to prepare the boardroom on the executive floor, and then I told her who to invite. The invitation that went out to Meredith gave nothing away. Eleanor's assistant drafted it on official Palisade letterhead, citing a mandatory review of the Silver Basin credit facility and requesting the presence of Ironwood's executive representative along with relevant legal counsel. It read the way compliance letters always read, procedural specific, bureaucratic in tone. Meredith received it, consulted with Brent, and concluded they were dealing with a documentation issue that could be resolved in a single session. She told me as much the morning before in the matter-of-fact tone she had been using for everything since the divorce papers arrived. Then she told me she wanted me to come with her. She said it with a particular quality of satisfaction. She said I had been living in comfortable ignorance about what her professional world actually looked like, and that watching a real executive meeting with real stakes might give me useful perspective. She did not say the word humiliating. She did not need to. The intent was audible in the structure of the sentence. I told her I would be there. Before the meeting, Meredith had texted Darlene and Paige the floor number and room location. She had promised them that after the session, they would all go together to look at an apartment she had found for me on the other side of downtown. Paige had her phone out before we reached the elevator. She said something to Darlene about how impressive the building was, and Darlene said something back about how satisfying it must be to work somewhere that actually mattered. Neither of them directed the remarks at me. I was already peripheral to the scene they had already written in their minds. The executive floor at Palisade was quiet, in the way genuine institutional power tends to be quiet, not the quiet of emptiness, but of people who have learned that raising their voice is rarely the most effective option available. The boardroom at the end of the hall had floor-to-ceiling windows looking west toward the mountains, a long, dark wood table and 12 chairs arranged with precision that signaled the meeting had been prepared for carefully. Eleanor's team had set out water and documents at each position. The board members were already seated. Outside counsel was present. 2 members of the audit team sat along the wall with their folders open. Meredith walked in ahead of me the way she walked into every room she had decided belonged to her. She moved toward the head of the table and began to pull the chair out. Eleanor stepped forward and, with the practiced warmth of someone who has delivered uncomfortable information without embarrassing anyone, indicated that the chair at the head of the table was reserved for the meeting's chair and directed Meredith to the seat designated for the borrowing institution's representative. Meredith looked around the room, recalibrating, and asked who was chairing the meeting. I walked past her and sat down. The entire board rose. It was not a dramatic gesture, it was simply what they did when I entered a room in that capacity, and so they did it without thinking. 12 people standing in a room that 30 seconds earlier Meredith had believed she understood completely. She looked at me the way people look at something when their mind is refusing to process what their eyes are supplying. I recognized the expression. I had seen smaller versions of it before whenever something failed to fit the story she had been telling herself. Eleanor introduced me. She used my full name, my title at Halcyon, and my position as controlling shareholder of Palisade National Bank. She did it in the same clear, measured tone she used for everything. Meredith said it was not possible. She said I had no real job, no professional position, that I could not even pay for dinner at a restaurant. I reached into my jacket and placed the card on the table between us. The card she had called the bank to freeze on the morning of the dinner at Orchard and Stone. I told her what she already knew, that it was linked to the household spending account she controlled, that she had suspended it before we sat down that evening, that the failed transaction at the restaurant had unfolded exactly as she had planned. Then I told her what she had not known: the bank that issued the card, whose systems had processed her authorization request that morning, operated under a structure that answered ultimately to me. I had not intervened when she made the call. I had not flagged it, reversed it, or issued any instruction. I let it stay frozen because I wanted to see what she would do with the power she believed she held. She had answered that question with considerable thoroughness. Eleanor then presented the ownership documentation, the Halcyon structure, the subsidiary entities, the holding company that held title to Foxmere House, and a summary of the financial arrangements that had supported their household throughout the marriage, including the advisory relationships that had, in the early years of Meredith's career, ensured that Ironwood's proposals received serious consideration at Palisade. None of it had been hidden in any legal sense. The documents had always existed. Meredith had simply never asked to see them, and I had never offered them unprompted, operating under an assumption I had held for far too long, that a marriage did not require that kind of accounting. Meredith sat very still through most of this. Brent, seated 2 chairs down, had adopted the particular stillness of someone performing calm while calculating exits. I moved the meeting to the audit findings. The external team presented their report without embellishment. The debt concealment was documented across 4 separate disclosure submissions. The revenue projections had been built on a methodology that bore no relationship to the contracted figures in the underlying agreements. The fabricated lease documents, submitted to trigger the next disbursement, were traced through file revision history to a workstation registered to Brent's Ironwood credentials. The final versions had been transmitted to the bank from Meredith's account on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the audit was initiated. Brent spoke before anyone directed a question at him. He said he had flagged concerns internally about the accuracy of the disclosures and had been overruled. He said that Meredith, as executive director of the project, had made the final decisions about what went into the submissions, and that his role had been to prepare draft materials based on her direction. He said it fluidly, in the tone of someone who had rehearsed several versions of this statement and selected the one most likely to serve him. Then he looked at the table rather than at Meredith. Meredith turned toward him. I watched her understand in the space of a few seconds that the man who had been sitting beside her at every dinner for the past 8 months, who had drafted the emails about minimizing my standing in the divorce, who had been given a key to a house he had never paid a cent toward, was now, with considerable composure, constructing a version of events in which she was the decision-maker and he was a subordinate who had documented his reservations. I told the room that Palisade would not be pursuing a resolution designed to serve my personal interests in any direction. The audit findings would be referred to the appropriate legal and regulatory bodies. The fate of the Silver Basin project would be evaluated based on its impact on the workers, investors, and community connected to it, not based on any outcome I preferred in a divorce proceeding. The recusal I had filed weeks earlier would remain in place through the completion of all proceedings. Then I set the revised divorce agreement on the table in front of Meredith. My attorney had prepared it to reflect what the assets actually were. Meredith would keep what was genuinely hers, her personal accounts, the assets she had accumulated through her own income, personal property, unconnected to the trust structure. She would not receive Foxmere House. She would not receive a settlement calculated on the fiction that I had contributed nothing to the marriage because that fiction was not supported by the record. Meredith looked at the document for a long time. Then she said she still loved me. She said the things she had done, the dinner, the video, the emails with Brent, the divorce strategy, had come from pressure and fear and the particular way Brent had spent the better part of a year reshaping how she saw her own life. She said she had not been herself. She said if I would let her, she wanted to explain everything properly. I waited until she was finished, then I asked her one question. If she had never found out that I owned this bank, if the divorce had proceeded on the terms she designed, if she had moved Brent into Foxmere House and built the life she had been planning, would she have apologized to me? Not because a boardroom full of people was watching, not because the leverage had reversed, just because she understood on her own that what she had done was wrong. She did not answer. She looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, not dishonesty, but the look of someone who has met a question they genuinely cannot answer, and understands that the inability to answer is itself the answer. I told her my attorney would be in touch. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, I could see Darlene and Paige in the corridor. They had been standing there long enough to watch the board rise when I entered the room, long enough to watch Meredith redirected away from the head of the table, long enough to understand without hearing the words what was happening on the other side of the glass. Paige's phone was at her side, pointed at the floor. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arranged themselves according to evidence rather than my preferences, which is how I had asked for it, and how I believe it should work. Meredith was placed on administrative leave at Ironwood for the duration of the regulatory review. Whether she would face formal charges depended on what the investigation established about her knowledge and intent distinctions I was not positioned to determine and had no interest in influencing. Brent was terminated within 10 days of the audit report reaching Ironwood's board. The internal emails, including the ones outlining the divorce strategy and the ones discussing the financial presentation methodology, were part of the documented record. His version of events became considerably less persuasive once those emails were read in sequence. Darlene called twice in the 2 weeks after the Palisade meeting. The second call I answered. She said she had always thought of me as family and hoped we could preserve some kind of relationship through everything that was happening. I told her I appreciated the call. I also told her that the things she had said at Orchard and Stone were an accurate record of how she saw me when she believed I had nothing. Nothing about me had changed between that evening and this phone call. The only thing that had changed was the information she was working with. She did not have a response to that, and we ended the call without resolving anything which felt honest. Paige deleted the video. By then, it had already circulated widely enough that the deletion changed its story, rather than erasing it. Some of the people who had shared it most enthusiastically began finding the original context less comfortable than they had initially. The divorce settlement was fair in the technical sense. It reflected an accurate accounting of what each of us had brought built and damaged over 11 years. She had enough to begin again on real ground. She did not have Foxmere House, or the trust assets, or the figure that had been calculated on the premise that I was a man with nothing. After the papers were signed, I did not stay in the house. I understood that the title was clear, the legal question settled. But a house is not the same thing as a home, and what that building held now was not something I wanted to live inside every day. I found a smaller property at the edge of the foothills west of the city, where the elevation changes and the mornings are quiet in a way that Denver proper never quite manages. There was a workshop off the back, a wide porch, and enough distance from the previous chapter that I could read Calvin's ledger without feeling like I was sitting inside a wound. I still run Halcyon. But I stopped treating invisibility as an unconditional virtue. There is a difference between refusing to perform your wealth and allowing the performance of your worthlessness to go unchallenged until it is being used against you in a legal filing. Calvin understood that distinction. It took me longer than it should have to find it. At Palisade, I asked Eleanor to help me establish a support program for people experiencing financial abuse in domestic situations, partners whose account access is controlled, whose spending is monitored and reported, whose economic dependence is used as the mechanism of humiliation. The program serves anyone who needs it, regardless of gender or circumstance. I have not announced it publicly. It does not need to be announced. On the shelf in my study, next to Calvin's ledger, there was a small frame. Inside it is the card that Meredith froze on the morning of the dinner at Orchard and Stone. I kept it not as a record of what she did, but as a reminder of what it taught me. A person's character is not revealed when they know they are being watched by someone with power over them. It is revealed in the moments when they believe the person in front of them has none. I did not come out of this intact because I had more money. I came out of it intact because when the moment came to use what I had as a weapon, I chose not to. That choice cost me something real. It also gave back something I had not fully realized I was losing. A clear sense of the person I wanted to remain, regardless of what anyone in the room believed about me. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, or stayed quiet in a moment when speaking up felt impossible, then you already understand what Garrett was carrying. Stories like this one exist because these experiences are real. Subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here worth your time.